On the morning of June 8, 2018, Eric Ripert knocked on his best friend's hotel room door in a small French town most people had never heard of, because Anthony hadn't shown up for dinner the night before, and he hadn't shown up for breakfast either, and that wasn't like him. What Ripert found on the other side of that door ended one of the most unlikely careers in television history, and left a question hanging in the air that nobody who loved Bourdain has fully stopped asking since: how does a man who spent his whole life running toward everything end up with nowhere left to go? The answer, it turns out, was building for decades. It lived in his marriages, in the substances he crawled out of and the ones he never fully left behind, in the loneliness that grew faster than the fame could fill it, and in a final relationship that broke something in him that hadn't healed yet. This is that story, and none of it is simple. Manhattan gave Anthony Bourdain to the world on June 25, 1956, and from the beginning, the forces shaping him pulled in completely different directions. His father, Pierre, was French Catholic, cultured, connected to the classical music industry, and his mother, Gladys, edited copy at the New York Times with the precision of someone who believed every word had to earn its place. Growing up in Leonia, New Jersey, under that kind of roof, young Anthony had everything except the one thing he actually wanted, which was freedom. His classmates roamed unsupervised through their summers while he attended Boy Scouts and family obligations, and that quiet resentment of the arranged life never fully left him, and it just found more sophisticated outlets over time. A family vacation to France cracked something open in him. Sitting on a fisherman's boat, he ate a raw oyster for the first time, and the experience rewired him completely. Not because of the taste alone, but because of the realization that the world held sensations he hadn't been given permission to want yet. That single moment planted the seed for everything that followed. Dwight Englewood School came and went in 1973, and Vassar College lasted exactly 2 years before the kitchens of Provincetown, Massachusetts made academia feel like a slow death by comparison. Bourdain walked away from Vassar and walked straight into the chaos of professional cooking, which is where he actually came alive. The Culinary Institute of America handed him a diploma in 1978, and New York City's restaurant scene absorbed him almost immediately after. What most people forget about Bourdain's early years is that cooking was never the whole story, because even then, running kitchens in Manhattan, he was grinding away at something else entirely. Back in the mid-1980s, he was sending unsolicited pieces to a small literary magazine called Between C and D, operating out of the Lower East Side, and one of his first published stories was about a chef searching for heroin, uncomfortable and honest and completely without apology. Gordon Lish, one of the most demanding editors in American literary history, ran a writing workshop that Bourdain enrolled in during 1985, and the experience sharpened a voice that was already unlike anything else being produced at the time. Random House came through with a book deal in 1990. His debut novel, Bone in the Throat, arrived in 1995, and it barely moved off the shelves. Gone, Bamboo followed and flopped just as hard. Bourdain funded his own book tour anyway, showed up to bookstores across the country, and kept pushing, which tells you everything about the stubbornness underneath the charisma. Kitchen Confidential changed everything. The memoir blew open the restaurant industry's secrets with the enthusiasm of someone who had nothing left to protect, and the reading public responded with the kind of hunger that publishers rarely see coming. Food Network came calling almost immediately, and A Cook's Tour premiered in 2002 with a premise so simple it shouldn't have worked as well as it did. Travel the world, eat everything, and talk about it honestly. By 2005, Anthony Bourdain. No Reservations had launched on the Travel Channel, and what he built there was something no amount of network strategy could have engineered. He sat on plastic stools in Vietnamese alleyways, shared food with families who had very little and gave generously anyway, and managed to make viewers feel the full weight of a place, its history, its grief, its stubborn dignity, through a single shared meal. Nigella Lawson once said his writing could shift from genuinely poetic to gloriously vulgar within the same breath. And that was exactly right. And it was exactly why it worked. Beirut, in 2006, is where the world understood that Bourdain was operating in a completely different category from anything television had produced before. His crew arrived to film a standard episode of No Reservations, and the Israel-Lebanon conflict erupted around them without warning. Stranded in a hotel with other expatriates, Bourdain didn't retreat into self-preservation mode. He documented, with the help of a local fixer he nicknamed Mr. Wolf after the problem solver in Pulp Fiction. U.S. Marines eventually evacuated the crew, and the resultant episode earned an Emmy nomination and proved beyond argument that this was journalism as much as it was food television. The man behind the camera had real courage, not the performed kind. None of that acclaim, none of those adventures, and none of those standing ovations erased what had been building inside him since the 1980s. Bourdain's addiction wasn't a footnote in his story. It was a central chapter he refused to hide. And New York's restaurant culture of that era practically cultivated substance abuse, with its inhuman hours and culture of excess, and Bourdain went under completely. Heroin and cocaine consumed years of his life, and his lowest moments were genuinely low. He described searching his carpet for leftover fragments of crack with the desperation of a man who had run completely out of other options. When Kitchen Confidential brought him fame, he wrote about all of it with the same unflinching honesty he brought to everything else, and that honesty built a connection with readers that no amount of polished celebrity management could have manufactured. He eventually walked away from heroin and cocaine, though alcohol stayed complicated. His recovery wasn't a clean redemption arc. It was messy and ongoing and real, which is why it resonated so deeply with so many people, especially those working inside the high-pressure world of restaurants and professional kitchens. What made his relationship with darkness so difficult to fully reckon with, looking back, was that it never actually left. Depression shadowed him through his most celebrated years, and references to mortality were scattered throughout his writing and his interviews, never dramatic or theatrical, but quiet and persistent, like a man who had been conducting a private negotiation with his own pain for most of his adult life and never fully won it. Nancy Putkoski was there for the darkest stretch. They met at Dwight Englewood School in New Jersey when they were teenagers. Their relationship outlasted Vassar and Provincetown in the struggling years in New York, and by 1985 they were married. Nancy supported him through the addiction, the failed novels, the years when nothing was working the way it was supposed to, and the marriage held through all of it, right up until it didn't. Kitchen Confidential arrived, fame followed with sudden and disorienting force, and Nancy preferred a private life in a way that was simply incompatible with the public one Bourdain was now living. The travel expanded, the attention multiplied, and by 2005 the gap had grown too wide. Their divorce was amicable by all accounts, and Bourdain spoke of her warmly for years afterward. The marriage had simply reached the end of what it could carry. Eric Ripert, Bourdain's closest friend and one of the most respected chefs in the world, introduced him to Ottavia Busia sometime after, believing they'd be a good match, and that instinct turned out to be correct in ways that were obvious almost immediately. Ottavia had been studying dentistry in Italy before restlessness drove her to leave everything behind and start over in New York with $300 and no real plan. She worked her way through the city's restaurant industry, eventually becoming general manager of Geisha, which is where she and Bourdain first met. The 22-year age difference between them registered as irrelevant almost immediately. Their bond grew through long conversations after her shifts, talking for hours about food and business and the particular madness of the industry they both lived inside. They married in 2007, and their daughter Ariane arrived not long after. Ottavia worked right up until she went into labor, and Bourdain, by his own admission, had never experienced anything quite like fatherhood. It reached something in him that adventure and acclaim hadn't managed to touch. But Parts Unknown, the CNN series that became the most critically celebrated work of his career, kept him on the road for roughly 250 days out of every year, and that kind of absence is simply incompatible with marriage in any honest mathematical sense. The weight of it accumulated slowly and then decisively, and in 2016, Bourdain and Ottavia separated. In the Roadrunner documentary, released after his death, Ottavia described watching something change in him after they split, a heaviness settling in, a dimming of the restless energy she had first fallen for. When he started therapy, she felt cautiously hopeful, gave him space, trusted the process. And it was a decision she would revisit with the kind of regret that doesn't resolve cleanly or quickly. Asia Argento arrived like something Bourdain hadn't seen coming and couldn't moderate once it hit. People close to him described watching him fall immediately and completely, comparing the intensity to a first crush, overwhelming, consuming, slightly dazzling to observe from the outside. Argento was fearless and unconventional, a filmmaker and actress with her own complicated history, and Bourdain gave himself over to the relationship without holding anything in reserve. When Argento became one of the leading voices of the MeToo movement, speaking out publicly against Harvey Weinstein, Bourdain stood beside her with the kind of loyalty that didn't calculate risk first. He admired her courage openly and defended her without qualification in every public forum available to him. Their relationship operated as an open one by mutual agreement, structured that way because both of them carried careers that demanded constant travel and independence, and the arrangement appeared to work for a while. Bourdain spoke in interviews about feeling genuinely content in a way he hadn't in years, about a sense of joy that the relationship had returned to him. But open arrangements carry their own vulnerabilities, and when Bourdain learned about an affair Argento had conducted in a location that held specific significance to their relationship, the betrayal landed somewhere already fragile. He reached out to her, trying to understand, looking for something he could hold on to. What came back was cold and distant, and the connection that had briefly given him his last sustained sense of happiness collapsed into something he didn't recognize and couldn't pull back together. By early June 2018, Bourdain was in Strasbourg, France, filming what would become the final episode of Parts Unknown, and those around him described a man carrying an exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. Fame, which had once felt like evidence of a life well chosen, had started to feel like a cage. Separating him from the things that had mattered before the cameras arrived widening the distance between him and any version of ordinary life. The relationship with Argento had effectively ended. The internal battles he had been quietly managing for decades had nothing left to balance against them. On the morning of June 8, 2018, Eric Ripert, the same man who had introduced him to Ottavia, who had stood beside him through so much of his adult life, went to check on his friend after Bourdain missed dinner the previous evening and breakfast that morning. Ripert found him in his room at Le Chambord Hotel. Anthony Bourdain had died by suicide. He was 61 years old. The grief that followed moved through the world differently than most celebrity deaths do. People didn't mourn him from a respectful distance. They mourned him the way they mourned someone they actually knew, because in a very real sense, many of them did. Decades of radical honesty had built something between Bourdain and his audience that outlasted every television contract and survived every career reinvention. Ottavia's reflections, offered carefully in Roadrunner and in the period afterward, captured the impossible position of caring for someone who is struggling from the outside. The hope that therapy represents, the space given in good faith, the question of whether a different choice could have changed the ending. She offered no clean answers because there aren't any. Anthony Bourdain resists every simple narrative anyone tries to build around him. He wasn't simply a man who had everything and lost it, because that framing misses the whole point. He was a man of irreconcilable contradictions, brilliant and private, celebrated everywhere and lonely at the center of it, free from the worst of his addictions, yet never fully released from the weight they had deposited inside him across all those years. He gave the world something genuinely rare, which was the unvarnished truth of what it actually feels like to be alive. They're restless, hungry, and uncertain about whether any of it is adding up to something. That gift didn't save him, but every episode of No Reservations and Parts Unknown, every page of Kitchen Confidential, every meal someone eats alone in a foreign city and feels, for just a moment, slightly less alone because of a voice they recognize. That's what remains, and it isn't nothing.